My name is Alex, and for the last 10 years, I've worked as a geological surveyor, which is just a technical way of saying I get paid to walk through some of the most remote and forgotten corners of this country. It's a job that has taken me from the blistering deserts of Arizona to the swampy wetlands of the Florida Panhandle. But my heart has always belonged to the mountains, specifically the high, cold, and unforgiving ranges of western Wyoming. It was there, during an annual elk hunting trip, that my understanding of the world was permanently broken. My best friend, Ben, and I have been making this trip every autumn since we got out of college. It was our ritual, our escape from the noise of regular life. We'd rent the same secluded cabin, nestled deep in the Shoshone National Forest, miles from the nearest paved road. It wasn't much, just a single room with a wood stove, 2 cots, and a small porch. But to us, it was a palace. It was our fortress of solitude, surrounded by millions of acres of raw, untamed wilderness. The silence up there is something you can't describe. It's so deep and heavy it feels like a physical presence. The old man who rented us the cabin, a grizzled fellow named Silas who'd lived in the valley his whole life, always gave us the same piece of advice when he handed over the keys. He'd lean in, his voice low and gravelly, and say, "Now you boys be careful up there. Once you get above the timber line, don't trust the shape of things in the snow." We always just smiled and nodded, assuming it was his folksy way of warning us about avalanches or the disorienting effects of snow blindness. We thought we understood. We were experienced outdoorsmen, after all. We knew the mountains. We were wrong. This particular year, the snows had come early. A massive cold front had swept down from Canada in late October, blanketing the high country in a thick layer of white. It was perfect for tracking, and the air was so crisp it felt like you could bite into it. When we arrived at the cabin, the world was a study in black and white. The dark, jagged peaks of the Absarokas clawing at a stark gray sky, the endless forests of pine and fir dusted with a heavy coat of fresh powder. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the snow and the low whistle of the wind through the lodgepole pines. We spent the first day settling in, just as we always did. We unpacked our gear, chopped enough wood to last us a week, and sighted in our rifles, taking turns sending bullets thudding into a rotted stump 100 yards from the porch. There was a comfortable rhythm to it all, a sense of tradition that was deeply reassuring. We were 2 old friends in our element, far from everything that could trouble us. The world felt simple and clean, governed by the basic laws of survival and the ancient dance of predator and prey. That evening, as the last of the daylight bled from the sky, we sat on the porch, nursing cups of steaming coffee and watching the stars begin to prick the darkening canvas above. The cold was sharp, but the wood stove inside kept the cabin toasty, its warm, orange light spilling from the single window. We talked about everything and nothing, work, family, the seasons past, and the ones to come. It was peaceful. It was perfect. But even then, a small, almost imperceptible thread of unease began to weave its way into the tapestry of our quiet retreat. It was just a feeling at first, a sense of being watched that was different from the normal awareness you have in the wilderness. Out there, you know you're part of the food chain. You know that mountain lions and bears are watching from the shadows. That's a known quantity, a risk you accept. This was something else. It was a prickling on the back of my neck, a sudden need to glance over my shoulder for no reason at all. I dismissed it as paranoia, the city dweller in me adjusting to the profound isolation. Ben didn't seem to notice anything. He was his usual self, calm and pragmatic, pointing out constellations and speculating on where the elk herds might be moving. He was the rock, the rational one. I had always been the more imaginative, the one prone to seeing shapes in the clouds. So I kept my unease to myself, chalking it up to the thin air and the overwhelming scale of the landscape. I told myself it was just the mountains, their immense, silent power playing tricks on my mind. I went to bed that night, feeling a little foolish. The warmth of the cabin and the familiar sound of Ben's quiet snores chasing away the last of the shadows. The next day, the real strangeness began. We were up before dawn, the air so cold it burned in our lungs. A fresh layer of snow had fallen overnight, and the world outside was pristine, a blank slate waiting for the story of the day to be written upon it. We bundled up in layers of woolen down, shouldered our packs and rifles, and set out as the first hints of pink and orange began to touch the eastern peaks. Our plan was to follow a long, ascending ridge that led to a high alpine basin, a place where we'd had luck in previous years. The hiking was strenuous, our boots sinking deep into the fresh powder with every step. The silence was even more profound than it had been at the cabin. The snow muffled everything, absorbing all sound until the only things you could hear were the rhythmic crunch of your own feet and the ragged pull of your own breath. We didn't talk much, conserving our energy for the climb. We moved through the dense forest, the ancient pines standing like silent sentinels, their boughs heavy with snow. It was beautiful, but in a way that felt vaguely threatening, as if the landscape itself was indifferent to our existence and would swallow us whole without a second thought. We broke through the timberline around mid-morning, and the world opened up. Before us lay a vast, sweeping expanse of white, a high-altitude desert of rock and snow. The wind picked up, a constant, biting force that whipped fine crystals of ice against the exposed skin on our faces. This was a different world, a place of raw, elemental power. It was here, in this stark and empty place, that we found the first thing that was truly wrong. We were moving across a wide, open snowfield, our eyes scanning the distant slopes for any sign of movement, when Ben suddenly stopped. He held up a gloved hand, and I froze behind him, my own rifle coming up instinctively. I followed his gaze, expecting to see the dark shape of an elk against the snow. But he wasn't looking at the horizon. He was looking down at the ground just ahead of us. I moved up beside him, my boots making soft, crunching sounds in the otherwise silent landscape. There in the snow was a line of tracks. But they weren't the tracks of an elk, or a deer, or a bear, or anything else we were familiar with. They were huge, for one thing. Each print was a deep, elongated oval, pressed several inches into the compacted snow. They looked almost like they'd been made by something with a single, massive foot, like someone hopping on a pogo stick. But there was a clear left-right pattern to them, indicating a bipedal stride. The stride itself was what truly baffled us. I measured it with my rifle. From the back of one print to the back of the next was a good 10 feet. 10 feet. No man could take a stride that long, not even downhill in deep snow. And these tracks were heading uphill against the slope. They moved in a perfectly straight line, from one end of the open snowfield to the other, before disappearing into a jumble of massive boulders near the base of a cliff. What in the hell makes a track like that? Ben murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. He knelt down, tracing the edge of one of the prints with his finger. There's no claw marks, no distinct toe impressions, just a depression. I knelt beside him, my mind racing through a catalog of every animal I knew. A moose? No, their tracks are cloven hooves, and their stride is nowhere near that long. A bear walking on its hind legs? It was a ridiculous thought, but even then, the tracks would have been wider, more humanoid, and the stride would have been a fraction of what we were seeing. It just didn't make any sense. Maybe it's just the wind. I offered, though the words sounded hollow, even to me. Like some snow got blown around and carved out these shapes. Ben shook his head, scraping at the snow beside one of the prints. No way. Look how firm the snow is here. And look at the edges of the print. They're too clean, too well-defined. Something heavy made these. Something that was putting a lot of pressure down with each step. We stood there for a long time, just staring at this impossible trail. The wind howled around us, and the vast, empty landscape seemed to mock our confusion. It was the first tear in the fabric of our rational, well-ordered world. A single, inexplicable detail that didn't fit. The tracks were fresh, too. The edges were still sharp, which meant they'd probably been made sometime since the snowfall last night. The thought that something that large, that strange, had passed this way so recently sent a cold shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Ben, ever the pragmatist, eventually straightened up and shrugged, though I could see the unease in his eyes. Well, whatever it was, it's not here now, and it's not an elk. Let's keep moving. He was trying to push it aside, to file it away under unexplained and get back to the task at hand. That was Ben's way. Find a logical box to put things in, and if you can't, build a new box. I wanted to agree with him. I wanted to dismiss it as a freak of nature, a trick of the wind and snow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed a line. We had stepped into a story that was not our own, and the opening chapter was a series of impossible footprints in the snow. As we continued our ascent, I kept glancing back at the tracks, a perfect, straight line bisecting the empty white expanse until they were finally lost to sight. But they weren't lost from my mind. They stayed there, a persistent, nagging question mark in the back of my thoughts. The mountains felt different after that. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. We hunted for the rest of the day, moving higher into the basin, but our hearts weren't in it. The strange discovery had cast a pall over the expedition. Every rock formation looked like a crouching figure in my peripheral vision, and every gust of wind sounded like a whispered voice. The joy of the hunt, the feeling of being a seamless part of the natural world, was gone. Now, I felt like an intruder. I felt like we were being tolerated at best. Ben was quieter than usual, though he tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. He'd point out a promising game trail or a good spot to glass the opposing ridge, but his movements were tense, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings with a new, nervous energy. The easy camaraderie of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a shared, unspoken anxiety. We were both thinking about the tracks, about the sheer physical impossibility of them. What kind of creature had a 10-foot stride and left prints like that? As dusk began to settle, painting the snow in shades of purple and blue, we reluctantly turned back towards the cabin. The descent was faster, but it felt more treacherous in the fading light. Shadows stretched and writhed, and the familiar landscape took on a sinister, alien quality. I was more aware than ever of how isolated we were. If something were to happen to us out here, if we were to get hurt or lost, no one would find us for days, maybe weeks. We were utterly, completely alone, or at least we had been telling ourselves we were. We reached the cabin just as full darkness fell, the last vestiges of light clinging to the highest peaks. The little wooden box, with its promise of warmth and shelter, had never looked so inviting. I fumbled with the latch on the door, my fingers clumsy with cold, and pushed my way inside, breathing a sigh of relief as the still, warm air enveloped me. Ben followed, shouldering his pack off with a weary grunt. He immediately went to the wood stove, stoking the embers back to life while I lit the gas lantern. The soft, hissing glow of the lantern filled the small space, pushing the oppressive darkness back outside the windows. The familiar, comforting smells of wood smoke and coffee soon filled the air, and for a little while, we were able to pretend that everything was normal. We made a simple dinner of canned stew and talked about our plan for the next day, carefully avoiding the subject that was weighing on both of our minds. But it was there, hanging in the air between us like the steam from our bowls. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the porch to grab another log for the fire. The night was brilliant, the sky a vast, glittering expanse of stars, undimmed by any city lights. The moon wasn't up yet, and the world was rendered in shades of deep indigo and black. The silence had returned, but it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was expectant. It felt like the held breath before a scream, and that's when I heard it. It started as a low, almost subaudible hum. I thought at first it was the wind, or maybe the vibration from a distant generator. But the air was perfectly still, and the sound was too steady, too rhythmic. It was a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't just a sound I was hearing with my ears. I could feel it in my chest, a palpable vibration that made the tiny hairs on my arms stand on end. I froze, my hand hovering over the woodpile, straining to identify the source. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't mechanical, but it wasn't animal either. It was a pure, sustained tone, almost like a massive organic tuning fork had been struck somewhere out in the darkness. It rose slowly in pitch and volume, the vibration intensifying until the very air around me seemed to shimmer with it. I felt a primal, gut-wrenching fear take hold. This was a sound that did not belong in these mountains. It did not belong anywhere in the natural world. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the impenetrable wall of darkness that surrounded our small island of lantern light. The humming continued to build, a deep, guttural thrum that resonated in my bones. I felt an irrational terror, a certainty that something ancient and terrible was awakening in the forest. Just as the sound reached a crescendo that felt like it would shake the very teeth from my skull, it stopped. Not faded away, but cut off. 1 second it was there, an all-encompassing physical presence, and the next there was only a ringing silence, deeper and more profound than before. I stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the heavy wooden door behind me and throwing the bolt. Ben looked up from his cot, his face pale in the lantern light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I could only nod, my own throat suddenly too dry to speak. So he had heard it too. I wasn't going crazy. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, listening, but there was nothing. The profound, watchful silence had returned. The world outside the cabin was once again a still, frozen tableau. But something had changed. The first incident, the tracks, had been unsettling, a mystery. This was different. This was a declaration. It was a clear and unambiguous message that we were not welcome here, and that we were not alone. The fear I felt was no longer a vague unease. It was a sharp, cold, and very real thing. And it was just the beginning. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every creak of the cabin walls, every skittering sound on the roof that was probably just a pine cone, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my system. I lay in my cot, staring up at the dark, timbered ceiling, my rifle on the floor beside me, within easy reach. The memory of that deep, resonant hum played over and over in my mind. It was a sound that felt older than the mountains themselves, a vibration that spoke of immense, unimaginable power. Ben was equally on edge. I could hear him shifting in his cot, the quiet rustle of his sleeping bag the only sound in the room. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We had both heard it, we had both felt it, and we had no way to explain it. To try and rationalize, it would have been an insult to the sheer, terrifying strangeness of the experience. We were two modern men, used to a world that made sense, a world governed by the laws of physics and biology. And we had just been confronted by something that defied all of our known categories. The night dragged on, a long, dark tunnel of anxiety. I must have drifted off at some point, because I was woken by the first, faint gray light of dawn filtering through the window. My body was stiff, my mind groggy, but the fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. I looked over at Ben. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, staring at the floor. He looked up and met my gaze, and I saw my own exhaustion and fear reflected in his eyes. "I'm not going back up there," he said, his voice flat. "Not to that basin." I didn't argue. The thought of returning to that high, exposed snowfield, to the place where we had found those impossible tracks, filled me with a deep and profound dread. "Okay," I said. "We could try the lower valley. Stick below the timberline." It was a compromise, a way of not admitting defeat, of not letting the fear drive us completely out of the mountains. But we both knew what it was. It was a retreat. The day was overcast and heavy. the sky a uniform sheet of dull gray. A sense of oppression hung in the air, thick and suffocating. We moved through the lower forests, the trees crowding in on us, their snow-laden branches muffling the world. It should have felt safer down here, in the familiar terrain of the deep woods. But it didn't. The feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. I found myself constantly stopping, turning my head, convinced I had caught a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. But there was never anything there. Just the silent, snow-covered trees. Around noon, we came across something else that stopped us in our tracks. It was in a small clearing, a place where a giant old pine had fallen long ago, leaving a gap in the canopy. In the center of the clearing, someone or something had built a structure. It was a tall, spindly tripod, about 9 or 10 feet high, made from 3 long, dead pine branches that had been stripped of all their bark. The branches were lashed together at the top, not with rope, but with what looked like long, twisted sinews of some kind. But the most disturbing part was what was hanging from the apex of the tripod. It was an elk skull, a large bull by the size of the bleached bone. But it had been altered. A series of strange, intricate symbols had been carved into the bone of the forehead, patterns that were not geometric, but fluid and organic, almost like a form of writing. And dangling from the points of the antlers were dozens of small, woven objects. I moved closer to get a better look. They were made from twigs and what looked like strands of dark, coarse hair woven into complex, spiraling shapes. They looked like some kind of primitive effigies or talismans. "This has to be some kind of joke," Ben said, his voice a low hiss. "Some other hunters trying to spook us." But there was no conviction in his words. We hadn't seen another soul since we'd left the main road. No other tire tracks on the long dirt path to the cabin. No other footprints on any of the trails. The idea that someone had hiked all the way out here into this remote clearing just to build this bizarre, ritualistic effigy was almost as unsettling as the alternative. I looked at the snow around the base of the tripod. It was undisturbed. The fresh powder from 2 nights ago was a perfect, unbroken sheet, save for our own tracks leading into the clearing. Whoever or whatever had built this had done so before that snowfall. It had been standing here, waiting. The air was thick with a strange metallic scent like ozone or blood, and something else underneath it, a musky, animal smell that made the back of my throat itch. We backed away from the clearing slowly, our rifles held at the ready. We didn't talk. A new layer of fear had been added to the pile. The tracks had been a physical anomaly. The sound had been an auditory threat. But this was different. This was evidence of intelligence, of purpose, of some kind of ritual or belief system that was utterly alien to us. It was a marker, a signpost, and it felt like it was intended for us. It felt like a warning. The rest of the day was a bust. We saw no game. In fact, we saw no wildlife at all. No squirrels chattering in the trees, no birds calling from the branches, no rabbit tracks in the snow. The forest was unnaturally silent, unnaturally still. It felt dead. It felt like every living creature had fled in the face of something that terrified them far more than a pair of human hunters. By the time we got back to the cabin, a light snow had begun to fall, thick, wet flakes that swirled in the windless air. The oppressive gray sky seemed to be sinking lower, pressing down on the landscape. The sense of isolation was now complete. We were locked in this valley with something that left impossible tracks, made impossible sounds, and built strange, threatening totems in the heart of the forest. That evening the storm hit. The light snowfall turned into a raging blizzard, the wind howling down from the high peaks with the freight train's fury. The cabin groaned under the assault, snow piling up in deep drifts against the walls. We were completely snowed in, cut off from the outside world. Our satellite phone, our one link to civilization, was useless. All we could get was static. The power of the storm was terrifying. The wind shrieked and moaned like a living thing, and the snow came down so thick we couldn't see more than a few feet past the porch. We huddled inside, feeding the wood stove, the flickering lantern light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The world had shrunk to the size of this single room, a tiny, fragile bubble of warmth and light in a maelstrom of cold and darkness. And in the brief lulls between the gusts of wind, we heard it again, the humming. It was closer this time, much closer. It was no longer a vague vibration coming from the landscape. It was a distinct sound just outside the cabin walls. It was a low, guttural thrum that seemed to snake its way through the cracks in the logs, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled deep in the pit of the stomach. Ben and I looked at each other, our faces grim. There was no rationalizing it now. There was no dismissing it as the wind. The sound was distinct, and it was intelligent. It would rise and fall, almost as if in response to the howling of the storm. Sometimes it sounded like a low growl, other times like a mournful chant. It was the sound of a language we could not comprehend, spoken by a throat that was not human. At one point, I dared to creep to the window, wiping a small circle of condensation from the frosty glass. I peered out into the swirling vortex of white. I couldn't see anything at first, just the endless, chaotic dance of the snowflakes. But then, for just a fraction of a second, I saw it. A shape, a flicker of movement in the chaos. It was tall, much taller than a man, and impossibly thin. A stark, black silhouette against the whiteout. It was there for a heartbeat, a vague, distorted form seen through the thick curtain of falling snow, and then it was gone. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Did you see it?" I gasped. Ben, who had been frozen by the stove, just shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "I don't want to see it," he whispered. "I don't want to know." We spent the rest of the night in a state of siege. We piled our heavy packs against the door and sat with our rifles across our laps, listening to the twin sounds of the raging blizzard and the low, terrifying hum that circled our tiny refuge. Sleep was out of the question. We were trapped animals, waiting for the predator to finally decide to break down the door. The feeling of utter helplessness was overwhelming. We were miles from help, armed with weapons that felt like children's toys against whatever was out there in the storm. I thought again of the old man, Silas, and his warning. Once you get above the timberline, don't trust the shape of things in the snow. We had thought it was a metaphor, a piece of folksy wisdom. We had been fools. It was a literal warning. It was a piece of advice born from a knowledge that we were only now beginning to comprehend. There were things in these mountains that defied explanation, things that had been here long before us and would be here long after we were gone. And we had trespassed into their domain. The blizzard raged for 2 solid days. 2 days and 2 nights of being trapped in that small cabin, listening to the storm and the thing that moved within it. The humming was not constant, but it would come and go, sometimes for hours at a time, a terrifying reminder that we were not alone. We rationed our food, speaking only when necessary, our voices low and hushed, as if we were afraid of being overheard. The psychological toll was immense. The walls of the cabin felt like they were closing in, and the constant, howling wind was like a sustained assault on our sanity. During that time, Ben began to change. The pragmatic, level-headed man I had known for 15 years started to unravel. He would sit for hours just staring at the cabin door, his knuckles white where he gripped his rifle. He stopped eating. He'd mutter to himself, strange, disjointed phrases. I'd catch him looking at me with a strange, paranoid glint in his eyes, as if he suspected I was somehow a part of what was happening. The isolation and the fear were breaking him, chipping away at the foundations of his rational mind. On the morning of the 3rd day, we awoke to silence. The wind had finally died down, and the world outside was eerily still. The snow had stopped. I cautiously moved to the window and looked out. The landscape was transformed. Everything was buried under a deep, pristine blanket of white. The snow was piled in massive drifts, some of them reaching halfway up the cabin walls. The trees were heavy with it, their branches bowed low, creating a strange, silent, white cathedral of the forest. "We have to go," Ben said, his voice a dry rasp. "We have to get out of here. Now." I agreed. The thought of spending another night in that place was unbearable. Our supplies were running low, but more than that, our nerves were shot. We had to make a break for it. We had to get back to the world of pavement and electricity and people, a world where things like this didn't happen. We packed what little we had left, our movements quick and frantic. The first real obstacle was the door. A massive drift had piled up against it. It took the two of us, throwing our combined weight against it, to force it open just enough to squeeze through. We emerged into a world that was blindingly white. The sun was out, a rare and welcome sight, and it glittered off the fresh snow with a painful intensity. But the beauty of the scene was lost on us. The air, which should have been clean and crisp after the storm, was tainted with that same faint smell we had noticed at the clearing. That strange, metallic, ozonic odor, mixed with the musky scent of a wet animal. It was a smell of wrongness. We made our way towards the old pickup truck we'd driven up in, which was now little more than a white mound in the distance. The going was brutal. The snow was waist-deep in places, and every step was a struggle. It was like wading through thick, wet concrete. Our breath plumed in the frigid air, and the silence was so complete that the frantic thumping of my own heart sounded like a drum. As we struggled through the deep snow, I noticed something that made the blood freeze in my veins. All around the cabin, circling it in a wide perimeter, were tracks. The same tracks we had seen up in the high basin. A single line of huge, deep, oval prints. The thing had been circling us during the storm. It had been walking around and around our tiny shelter for 2 solid days. The snow had filled in the older tracks, but the last few circuits were still fresh, still sharp. It had been out here, just a few feet from us, as we huddled in terror. I didn't point them out to Ben. I didn't think he could take it. He was already on the verge of breaking, his eyes wide and constantly darting towards the dark line of the trees. He was like a prey animal, sensing the predator long after it has passed. We finally reached the truck, our legs burning, our lungs aching. I brushed the snow off the driver's side door, pulled the handle, and slid in, a wave of relief washing over me. We were safe. We were in a steel box. We were going to get out of here. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. Nothing. Not even a click. The battery was completely, totally dead. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal uselessly. Nothing. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel in frustration and despair. The truck had been fine when we arrived. A new battery, a recent tune-up. There was no reason for it to be dead. It was impossible. No. Ben chanted from the passenger seat, his head in his hands. This can't be happening. But it was. We were stranded. Our last hope of a quick escape was gone. We were miles from the nearest road, with no way to call for help, in a valley that was home to something that was actively hostile towards us. The silence outside the truck suddenly felt immense and full of menace. "We walk," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. "We follow the road. It's all downhill. We can make it to the main highway by nightfall if we push ourselves." It was our only option. Staying here meant another night in the cabin, another night of listening to the humming and the circling footsteps. I would rather die of exposure on the road than spend another minute in that place. Ben just nodded numbly, his face ashen. We gathered our packs from the truck bed, took our rifles, and started walking. The truck road was barely visible under the deep snow, just a slight depression in the landscape. We walked in single file, me in the lead, trying to set a steady pace. The world was silent, save for the rhythmic crunch of our boots. For the first few hours, it seemed like we might actually make it. The initial shock and despair gave way to a grim determination. We were alive. We were moving. Every step took us further away from the cabin and closer to safety. The sun was on our faces, and the sheer physical effort of the trek was a welcome distraction from the terror that gnawed at the edges of our minds. But the mountains were not done with us yet. We had been walking for about 4 hours when we came around a bend and saw the high basin open up to our right. It was the same basin where we had seen the first tracks, a vast amphitheater of snow and rock. And my eyes were immediately drawn to a single, dark speck against the endless white. It was far away, at least a mile, on the other side of the basin. But it was there. I stopped, raising a hand to shield my eyes from the glare. Ben stopped behind me. "What is it?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, though a cold dread was already beginning to form in my gut. "It's probably just a rock formation, a shadow." But I knew it wasn't. Rocks don't just appear in the middle of a perfectly flat snowfield. I unslung my rifle and brought the scope to my eye, the cold metal pressing against my skin. I dialed up the magnification, trying to get a clear view. The air was shimmering with the cold, distorting the image, but I could make it out. It was not a rock. It was a figure. It was standing perfectly still, a tall, vertical shape in a horizontal world. It was impossibly thin, its limbs long and spidery, and it was a deep, matte black, absorbing the brilliant sunlight. It had no discernible features, no clothes, no gear. It was just a shape, a silhouette of pure wrongness. While hunting elk, we saw something standing upright in the snow. And this was it. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel my heart begin to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. It was just standing there, in the middle of that vast, empty expanse, as if it had been waiting for us. I lowered the rifle, my hands shaking. "What is it, Alex?" Ben pleaded, his voice cracking. "What did you see?" I couldn't answer him. I couldn't find the words. I just raised a trembling finger and pointed across the basin. Ben squinted, his eyes following my direction. It took him a moment to find it, a tiny black needle in a haystack of white. But when he did, he made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp of pure terror. And then, the worst part, as if it knew we were looking at it, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't run. It began to glide. It moved across the surface of the snow with a smooth, effortless, and utterly unnatural speed. It was closing the distance between us, and it was doing so at a terrifying rate. The perfectly straight line of its approach was chillingly familiar. It moved just like the tracks we had seen, in a direct, purposeful line, without deviation. Panic, raw and absolute, seized me. The thin veneer of civilization, of courage, of rational thought, was stripped away in an instant, leaving only the primal, animal instinct to flee. "Run!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat. "Ben, run!" We turned and plunged into the deep snow beside the road, scrambling, falling, and getting up again. The rational part of my brain was screaming that running in waist-deep snow was a fool's errand, that we were burning precious energy, that we couldn't possibly outrun something that moved like that. But instinct had taken over. We were no longer hunters. We were prey. I didn't dare look back. I just focused on the next step, on lifting my heavy boots out of the thick, clinging snow and planting them again. My lungs were on fire, my muscles screaming in protest. The cold air felt like shards of glass in my throat. Beside me, I could hear Ben's ragged, panicked gasps for air. The sound started then. Not the low hum from before, but something else entirely. It was a high-pitched, warbling cry, a sound that sliced through the silent air like a knife. It was a sound of pure malevolence, of triumphant, alien hunger. It was the sound of the predator closing in. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my heart stopped. It was closer now, so much closer. It had crossed the entire basin in what felt like seconds. It was at the edge of the road, perhaps 200 yards away, and I could see it more clearly. Its limbs were too long for its body, jointed at odd, insect-like angles. It had no discernible head, just a smooth, tapered torso that ended in a point. It moved on 2 legs, but its motion was not like walking. It was a fluid, seamless slide, its feet never seeming to break the surface of the snow. The sight of it broke something in my mind. It was so fundamentally wrong, so utterly outside the bounds of anything I'd ever thought possible, that my brain simply refused to process it. All I knew was that it was death. It was an ancient, predatory thing that had no place in our world, and it was coming for us. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline and terror coursing through my veins. The trees. We had to get to the trees. The dense forest was our only hope of breaking its line of sight, of finding some kind of cover. It was only 50 yards away, but it might as well have been a mile. Ben stumbled and fell beside me, disappearing into a deep drift of snow with a cry of despair. I turned back, grabbing his arm, hauling him to his feet. His face was a mask of sheer, animal terror, his eyes wide and unfocused. "We're not going to make it," he sobbed. "Yes, we are," I screamed, pulling him along. "Come on." The shrieking sound was closer now, right behind us. I could feel it. I could feel its presence, a cold, predatory aura that was as real as the snow under my feet. I didn't look back again. I didn't want the last thing I ever saw to be that impossible, horrifying shape. We crashed into the tree-line, the branches of the low-slung pines whipping at our faces. We were in the forest, but we weren't safe. We kept running, stumbling over hidden roots and fallen logs buried beneath the snow. The trees offered some cover, but they also made the going even more difficult. The shrieking was everywhere now, echoing through the silent woods, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. We ran blindly, fueled by nothing but terror. My pack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, my rifle a useless anchor. At some point, I lost my grip on Ben's arm. I turned and he was gone. I screamed his name, my voice raw and desperate. "Ben!" There was no answer, only the mocking echo of my own voice and the high, warbling cry of the thing that was hunting us. I stood there for a second, my mind reeling, my body screaming at me to keep moving. I had to go back. I had to find him, but I was paralyzed by fear. And then I heard a new sound, a wet, tearing sound, followed by a single, choked-off scream. It was Ben's voice, and it came from just a few yards away, behind a thicket of young fir trees. The alien shrieking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural, and deeply disturbing series of clicks and wet, tearing noises. I knew what had happened. I knew I couldn't help him. Ben was gone. The thing had him. A wave of nausea and grief and terror, so profound it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. But the instinct to survive was stronger. I turned and I ran. I ran harder than I have ever run in my life. I ran until my legs gave out, until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I ran without looking back, away from the sound of my friend's death, away from the thing that was now feasting in the silent, snow-covered woods. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran for. Time had lost all meaning. The world had shrunk to the next tree, the next step, the next ragged breath. The sun began to set, and the woods grew dark and filled with terrifying shadows. I was lost, exhausted, and slipping into shock. I kept moving, a numb, stumbling automaton, driven by a single primal command: survive. I must have eventually stumbled back onto the truck road, though I have no memory of it. The next thing I remember clearly is seeing headlights. A pair of bright, beautiful headlights cutting through the twilight. I collapsed in the middle of the road, waving my arms weakly. The vehicle, a huge county snowplow, ground to a halt just a few feet from me. A man in a thick jacket and a beanie jumped out of the cab, his face a mixture of shock and concern. "Jesus, kid, what are you doing out here? You're going to get yourself killed." I tried to speak, to tell him what had happened, to warn him. But all that came out was a series of incoherent sobs. He helped me into the warm cab of the plow, wrapped me in a thick wool blanket, and gave me a thermos of hot, sweet coffee. He kept asking me what had happened, where my friend was. I couldn't answer. I just sat there, shaking uncontrollably, staring out at the dark, silent forest that had taken my friend. The plow driver radioed it in. A lost hunter, suffering from exposure and shock. He told them my friend was still out there somewhere. A search and rescue team was mobilized, but the weather closed in again that night, and they couldn't get up the mountain for another 2 days. They found the truck, of course. The mechanic who eventually towed it down to the town garage said he couldn't find a single thing wrong with it. The battery was fully charged. It started on the first try. They never found Ben. They searched for a week with dogs and helicopters once the weather cleared. They found one of his gloves and a few drops of blood in the snow that were confirmed by DNA to be his. But that was it. No body, no weapon, no other tracks besides his own. The official report said he likely succumbed to the elements, and his body was carried off by scavengers. A mountain lion, perhaps. I know what happened. I know it wasn't a mountain lion. I was in the hospital for a few days, treated for severe frostbite and exhaustion. I tried to tell the sheriff what we had seen. I told him about the tracks, the sound, the tripod in the woods. I told him about the tall, black figure that moved like the wind. He listened patiently, then gently suggested that the altitude, the cold, and the stress of being lost in a blizzard can make a man see things. He said the mountains play tricks on your mind. I never went back to those mountains. I never will. I quit my job. I couldn't stand the thought of being in the wilderness again. I live in a city now, surrounded by concrete and steel and the noise of millions of people. I need the noise. The silence is what I can't handle. In the silence, I can still hear that high-pitched, warbling cry. Sometimes late at night, when the city is as quiet as it ever gets, I'll pull out a map of the Shoshone National Forest. I'll look at the vast, empty spaces on the page, the places marked as wilderness, where there are no roads, no towns, no people. And I'll think about what's out there, living in the high, cold, lonely places. I think about the old man, Silas, and the warning he gave us every year, the warning we never truly understood until it was too late. I could still hear his gravelly voice, and I finally understand the terror that lay behind his words. He wasn't just sharing a folksy saying. He was telling us a truth he had likely learned the hard way himself. Once you get above the timberline, don't trust the shape of things in the snow. It's not a trick of the light. It's not your mind playing games. It's a warning. There are things out there, standing in the endless white, that look like they might have once been men, but there's something else entirely. And they are waiting.